a family man who finds, in the toughest times and discovers a new meaning for, in the tranquility of Fremont, James believed he had found the perfect place to build his life. But when the unexpected happens, he is forced to make decisions that will change everything. With a dream hanging by a thread and his family falling apart, James faces challenges that could push him to the brink. Will he be able to overcome adversity and rewrite his destiny? Discover a story of courage and resilience, where hope emerges in the darkest moments. Fremont was a town that could easily be found in a memory book, with its wide streets lined with lush trees and red brick houses that seemed to withstand the test of time. It was a place that offered the promise of a peaceful life, where people could raise their families in peace, far from the chaos of big cities. When James and Claire decided to move there, they felt they were finally taking the first step toward the future they had always dreamed of. That day, the sky was clear, and a gentle breeze seemed to carry a silent blessing, a sort of divine approval for the new phase they were about to begin. James was 40 years old, and though he wasn't one for grand displays of emotion, he couldn't contain his smile as he looked at Claire and their 1-year-old son, Tommy. Claire, with her natural serenity, carried Tommy in her arms as the three walked through the new neighborhood, admiring every detail. The distant sound of children's laughter and the occasional creaking of swings in the nearby park created an idyllic, almost surreal scene. They knew this would be the place where Tommy would take his first steps, where he would speak his first words, and where they would build a life full of small, everyday joys. The new red brick house was modest, but for James and Claire, it felt like a palace. There was a sense of a fresh start, that everything was still to come, full of possibilities. James, with his stable job at the local auto parts factory, felt secure, something that was increasingly rare in the modern world. The factory routine wasn't glamorous, but he appreciated the regularity, the steady rhythm that allowed him to know what to expect from each day. Claire, on the other hand, was a dedicated teacher at the local elementary school, and her love for teaching shone through in every conversation she had about her students. She spoke of the children with a sparkle in her eyes, a passion that James deeply admired. But there was something else that filled James's thoughts, something he kept as a precious secret. Since he was young, he had dreamed of opening his own coffee shop. It wasn't just about the coffee itself, but about the environment he wanted to create. A cozy place where people could meet, share stories, and, for a moment, forget the worries of the day. He imagined a space with rustic wooden tables, large windows that let the morning sun in, and a bookshelf filled with books where customers could get lost in a good read while enjoying a hot drink. For years, this dream was nurtured in silence, growing slowly as he and Claire saved every penny. They discussed the coffee shop as a future idea, something he would do when Tommy was a little older, when things were more stable. It was a promise to himself and his family, something that symbolized his desire to leave a legacy, something he could pass on to Tommy when he grew up. However, life in Fremont, which had started so promisingly, took an unexpected turn. The factory where James worked, the same one that had provided the security he valued so much, abruptly closed its doors. The news hit like a blow, something no one in town had expected. Hundreds of workers, including James, were left to fend for themselves, with few prospects of where to go next. The town, which once buzzed with the energy of machines and the constant movement of workers, fell into a disconcerting silence. For James, the factory's closure was as if the ground had opened up beneath his feet. He found himself facing an abyss of uncertainty, with a family to support and a dream that seemed increasingly distant. Claire, despite her strength and optimism, couldn't hide the growing concern in her heart. They had invested all their savings in the house and the future they planned to build there. And now all of that was at risk. Amid the despair, James and Claire made a bold decision. With the few savings they had left, they decided to invest in the long-awaited coffee shop. But to do so, they had to look for a new town where opportunities might be better. They chose a place nearby, but different enough for them to start over. It was a risky bet, but they were willing to make the sacrifice. The first few days were marked by a mix of hope and fear. James dedicated all his time to renovating the small space he had rented, carefully choosing every detail. He clung to this work as if it were his last chance to give his family the life he had always wanted. The rustic wooden tables, the frames with inspiring quotes, the smell of freshly brewed coffee. Everything there was a physical manifestation of his dream. Claire supported him, helping whenever she could, but there was a shadow of doubt in her eyes that James couldn't ignore. She knew the business world well and understood that the road ahead would be long and difficult. As the months passed, reality began to set in cruelly. The flow of customers was much lower than they had anticipated, and the bills began to pile up, threatening to crush James and Claire's dreams. The nights that were once filled with laughter and conversations about the future became silent, heavy with the tension of mounting debts and a fear that refused to be named. Each day seemed to bring a new challenge, and the coffee shop, which was supposed to be their salvation, became an unbearable burden. The breaking point came on a rainy night. Claire, exhausted by the situation and the constant pressure, decided she couldn't continue. After a heated argument, she packed her bags and left, leaving James alone with Tommy. As the door closed behind her, James felt as if all the air had been sucked out of the room. He watched helplessly as the woman he loved walked away, taking with her not just her belongings, but also the last spark of hope he still had. Now, James found himself at a crossroads. With Tommy still too young to understand what was happening, he knew he had to be strong, but the feeling of failure was overwhelming. Fremont, the town that once represented a new beginning, now seemed like a place of despair and uncertainty. The life he had imagined for his family was falling apart before his eyes, and he wondered if he could find a way out of the dark maze his life had become. The early morning in Fremont was cold, and loneliness seemed to envelop James in a cruel way. Sitting at the kitchen table, he stared at the pile of bills next to a cup of cold coffee. Each piece of paper was a reminder of the debts that continued to accumulate. The silence in the house was deafening, a bitter contrast to the days when Claire and Tommy filled the space with laughter and conversations. James felt powerless. He never imagined his life could fall apart so quickly. In less than a year, he had lost his job, sunk into debt, and now he was alone to care for his son. The coffee shop, which was supposed to be his safe haven, had become a burden. The foot traffic was scarce, and the money coming in barely covered basic expenses. Each day, the noose around his neck tightened a little more. He tried to stay calm in front of Tommy, but inside he felt like a failure. He remembered Claire's words before she left. "I can't do this anymore, James. I tried, but I can't see a way out. I need some time to think." Although she hadn't said it was a definitive goodbye, James knew there was something final in her words. She had lost faith in him, and that was what hurt the most. The next morning, James got up early, even after a sleepless night. He made breakfast for Tommy, trying to maintain a calm expression as his son asked when his mom would return. Each question was like a blow, and the answer was always the same: "Soon, son. She just needs some time." But James knew these words brought no comfort to him or Tommy. After dropping Tommy off at school, James drove to the coffee shop. The space, which once represented a dream, now felt like a constant reminder of his failures. The tables were empty, and the smell of fresh coffee couldn't mask the frustration that hung in the air. He spent the whole day there, waiting for customers who never came. The hours dragged on, and his mind wandered, trying to find a solution, but nothing seemed to work. On the way back home, James was pulled over by a police officer. Another fine for speeding. When the officer handed him the ticket, James could no longer hold back the tears. He felt humiliated, a defeated man, unable to move forward. Upon arriving home, he found a letter from the landlord. The notice was clear. If he didn't pay the overdue rent within a week, he would be evicted. James looked at Tommy, who was playing on the living room floor, unaware of the drama unfolding. He knew he couldn't let his son end up on the streets, but he couldn't see how he could come up with the money in such a short time. Despair began to set in, a dark shadow that threatened to consume him. He tried to find strength in memories of better days, in the promises he made to himself and his family. He remembered the day Tommy was born, the joy he felt when he held his son in his arms for the first time. At that moment, he vowed to do everything to protect him, to ensure he had a life full of love and opportunities. Now he saw that vow slipping through his fingers, like sand lost in the wind. That night, while putting Tommy to bed, James felt a pang of fear thinking about the future. He was on the brink of collapse and didn't know how to deal with it. He looked at his son's sleeping face and wondered if he would ever be able to give him the life he had promised. He felt small, unable to face the challenges life had thrown at him. The weight of responsibilities, of the expectations he had created for himself, seemed greater than he could bear. The silence of the night enveloped the house, but inside James, chaos raged like a furious storm. He knew he needed a solution, but as he looked at the piles of bills and the emptiness around him, everything seemed increasingly impossible. The dawn in Fremont brought a soft light, but for James, this morning brightness offered no comfort. Each new day was a battle he forced himself to fight, even when all his strength seemed to have been drained. He woke up with a heavy mind, shoulders bowed under the weight of despair and responsibility. The daily routine of getting Tommy ready for school, of trying to smile despite the pain consuming his heart, became an increasingly unbearable burden. Tommy, with his childlike innocence, was beginning to realize that something was terribly wrong. His mother's absence, the sadness that dominated his father's eyes, the oppressive silence that now filled the house. All of this added up to create an atmosphere of tension that even a 5-year-old couldn't ignore. The questions that were once asked frequently, "When is mommy coming back?" became less common, replaced by an uneasy silence that, for Tommy, was both incomprehensible and frightening. James, for his part, was on the verge of collapse. He tried to find a solution to the problems that were piling up like an insurmountable mountain, but each attempt seemed more desperate and fruitless than the last. He went to the coffee shop once again, hoping that day would be different. But upon entering, what he found was just more of the same. Empty tables, a cold, lifeless space that reflected exactly how he felt inside. The coffee machine, which he once bought with such enthusiasm, now seemed like a monument to his failure, a constant reminder of everything that had gone wrong. With trembling hands and a heavy heart, James decided to do something he had been avoiding. He called Claire. Her voice, even in its absence, was a balm he desperately needed to hear. But instead of a conversation, he found only the cold voicemail. Still, he left a message, his voice choked with emotion and despair. "Claire, I don't know what to do. I need help. Tommy misses you, and I don't know how to go on. Please, call me when you can." Each word was a plea, an admission of defeat he never imagined he would have to make. The day continued at a slow and suffocating pace. James tried to sell what he could, called friends he hadn't contacted in years, and even begged for a loan at the bank. In each of these attempts, he found closed doors, refusals that added even more weight to his already tired shoulders. As the sun began to set, James felt that he was running out of time, out of options, and out of hope. That late afternoon, James picked Tommy up from school, as he did every day. But on this occasion, he could barely hear his son's words. Tommy's cheerful voice, describing something he had learned at school, seemed distant, muffled by the whirlwind of thoughts consuming James's mind. All he could think about was the rent deadline, the imminent threat of losing the house, and the devastating possibility of not being able to provide even the basics for his son. When they arrived home, James found another letter waiting for him. It was a formal notice from the court about the eviction process. He had 7 days to pay what he owed or he would have to leave the house. Reading those words, James felt as if the ground had disappeared beneath his feet. A dizziness overtook him, and for a moment, he needed to lean against the wall to avoid falling. Tommy, noticing the change in his father's expression, asked if everything was okay. James just forced a smile and said it was, but the truth was that he could no longer hide the truth from his son, or from himself. That night, after putting Tommy to bed, James sat on the living room sofa, staring at the wall, lost in thoughts that swirled in his mind like an uncontrollable whirlwind. The feeling of helplessness was overwhelming. He wondered if there was any chance of escaping this cycle of failures and despair. He wondered if, somehow, he could protect Tommy from the chaos that threatened to engulf their lives. The dreams that once sustained him now seemed unbearable burdens, and the hope that had once been a constant flame in his heart was now a faint, flickering light. The silence of the night enveloped the house, but inside James, chaos raged like a furious storm. He knew he needed a miracle, but at that moment, miracles seemed as distant as the stars hidden by the thick clouds outside. The cold, relentless reality was there, confronting him every moment, reminding him that, in the real world, happy endings were rare. But even so, a part of James refused to completely give in. Somewhere, deep within him, a small spark of hope still persisted, even when everything around him seemed to be falling apart. The night in Fremont seemed darker than ever. The stars, usually bright in the clear sky, were hidden by heavy clouds threatening a storm. James was sitting on the living room floor, surrounded by empty boxes and scattered papers. The silence in the house was broken only by the distant sound of approaching thunder. The environment perfectly reflected the internal chaos consuming his mind and heart. After days of trying to find a solution, James felt that all the doors were closing in front of him. Unreturned calls, constant rejections, and the lack of answers had led him to a state of physical and emotional exhaustion. The deadline for paying the rent was running out, and the prospect of losing the roof over Tommy's head was terrifying. He had never felt so alone, so powerless in the face of circumstances. While rummaging through some old boxes in search of documents that might help in some way, James found a worn blue-covered notebook. He recognized it immediately. It was Claire's diary. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the first page, where her delicate handwriting recorded her most intimate thoughts. He hesitated for a moment, but the need to feel a connection with her pushed him to continue. The pages were filled with dreams, plans, and hopes that Claire nurtured for the family. She wrote about the happy moments they shared, the difficulties they overcame together, and above all, the deep love she felt for James and Tommy. Each word was like a warm embrace, bringing to the surface emotions that James had tried to suppress. Silent tears rolled down his face as he delved into the memories contained in that notebook. On one of the last pages, he found a letter addressed to him. The date indicated it was written shortly before Claire left. With a racing heart, he began to read, "Dear James, I know things have been difficult and we've faced storms we never imagined. I want you to know that I never doubted your strength and your ability to guide us through the darkness. Leaving was the most painful decision I've ever made, but I felt I needed to give you space to find your way again. I believe in you, James. I know that even in the darkest moments, there is a light within you that can light the way for all of us. Tommy needs you now more than ever, and I know you will be the wonderful father you always have been. Find the strength I know exists within you. Remember the dreams we shared and use them as fuel to move forward. I'll be rooting for you always. With all my love, Claire." Claire's words pierced deeply into James's soul. It was as if a forgotten flame was reignited within him, spreading warmth and hope where there had only been cold and despair. He realized that despite the distance, Claire still believed in him, and that was all he needed to gather his strength and fight once more. At that moment, his phone vibrated on the table, breaking the moment of reflection. When he picked up the device, he saw an unknown number flashing on the screen. With a mixture of curiosity and apprehension, he answered the call. "Hello, James? It's Peter. I don't know if you remember me from the factory." The familiar voice brought a wave of memories. Peter was an old coworker, always friendly and willing to help. James hadn't expected to hear from him again, but there he was at the most crucial moment, like a sign that perhaps things could change. Peter explained that he had heard about James's difficult situation through other former coworkers and that he was working at a construction company that needed temporary labor. It was a project to rebuild homes for families affected by natural disasters in a nearby town. The job not only paid well but could also open doors to future opportunities. James felt a mixture of relief and gratitude wash over him. It was the first good news in a long time, a real chance to start reorganizing his life. He thanked Peter profusely, arranging a meeting for the next day and feeling, for the first time in months, a spark of optimism. He hung up the phone and looked around the room with new eyes. What once seemed like a scene of defeat was now transforming into a field of possibilities. He knew the road would still be tough, but he was willing to take every step, armed with the faith renewed by Claire's words and the helping hand of a friend. James quietly climbed the stairs and entered Tommy's room. The boy was sleeping soundly, with a serene expression that warmed his father's heart. He approached the bed and gently stroked his son's hair, whispering, "We're going to be okay, my boy. I promise you." Outside, the storm that had threatened to break seemed to have changed direction, leaving the sky clearer and a fresh breeze entering through the slightly open window. James took a deep breath, absorbing that renewed air and feeling more alive than ever. The horizon, once dark and uncertain, was now beginning to brighten with the promise of a new dawn. The next dawn brought with it new energy, a renewed drive that James hadn't felt in a long time. He woke up before the sun rose with an unusual determination. The previous day, which had begun as another dark episode in his life, had ended with a promise of change, and he knew he couldn't let this opportunity slip away. Tommy was still sleeping peacefully when James left the house, leaving a note on the table. "Daddy will be back soon. Have a good day at school, champ." As he walked through the still quiet streets of Fremont, James felt the weight of uncertainties, but also a spark of hope. He was eager to meet Peter and discuss the details of the new job, feeling that he could finally start reorganizing his life. Arriving at the agreed meeting spot, he saw Peter waiting with a welcoming smile. Peter was a robust-looking man, with the marks of a hard-working life, but his eyes revealed a kindness that was comforting. They greeted each other with a firm handshake and, without wasting time, Peter began to explain the project of rebuilding homes for families who had lost everything in recent floods. "It's heavy work, but rewarding," Peter said as they walked through the site where the work was already underway. "We're rebuilding lives, James, and that makes all the difference." These words echoed deeply within James. He had always valued physical work, the effort of creating something with his own hands. And now, the idea of rebuilding not just houses but also hopes seemed to give him a new purpose, something he hadn't felt in a long time. As he got to know the work team, James felt an instant camaraderie. They were people from different backgrounds, united by a common goal. There, among those people, he found something he had lost, a sense of belonging, of being part of something bigger than himself. Every hammer blow, every wall raised, every act of solidarity brought him closer to what he had always wanted: dignity, confidence, and faith in himself. However, reality still loomed over him. The debts were still there, the threat of losing the house was still real. The money from the temporary job wouldn't be enough to cover all the expenses, and the deadline for paying the rent was fast approaching. One night, after a long day of work, James sat in the small makeshift office of the coffee shop. He looked at the pile of invoices, each one a reminder of the weight he still carried. But something had changed within him. Instead of succumbing to despair, he felt a new idea emerging. As he observed the empty space of the coffee shop, his mind began to work. He remembered Peter's words about the impact they were having on the lives of the families they were helping. James began to wonder if he could do something similar with the coffee shop, something that would bring the community together and give the place a new purpose. What if the coffee shop wasn't just a place to drink coffee, but a community space where people could learn new skills? James thought of woodworking workshops, furniture repair, cooking classes, activities that could empower the community, offering more than just a cup of coffee, but also knowledge and mutual support. As the idea took shape, James felt the excitement growing. He knew it wouldn't be easy, but something about that vision seemed irresistible. If he could transform the coffee shop into a community space, he wouldn't just save the business but also help build a stronger, more united community. The next day, during a break at work, James shared his idea with Peter. They were sitting on a pile of stacked wood, watching the progress of the construction, when James began to describe his vision. Peter listened attentively, and a smile began to form on his face. "That's incredible, James," Peter said, patting him on the shoulder. "You have a big heart, and you know what? I think we can make this happen." Peter's support was like fuel for the fire burning within James. They began to plan how they could transform the coffee shop into a community space, involving other co-workers and neighbors. James saw the pieces of the puzzle beginning to fit together, each detail taking shape in his mind. That night, for the first time in a long time, James returned home with a feeling of genuine hope. He still didn't have all the answers, but he knew he was on the right path. When he arrived home, he found Tommy waiting for him with a drawing in his hands. It was a house with James and Tommy drawn in front of it, both smiling. "It's our house, Daddy," Tommy said, with a smile that lit up James's heart. He looked at the drawing and felt a deep emotion, a confirmation that, despite everything, he was doing the right thing. Now, more than ever, James was determined to turn his vision into reality. The coffee shop wouldn't just be a business. It would be a symbol of renewal, of resilience, of a community united by overcoming adversity. And he, along with Tommy, would be at the center of this transformation, rebuilding not just a physical space, but their own lives. The days that followed became a mix of hard work and renewed hope. James was determined to turn his idea into reality. With the help of Peter and other co-workers from the construction site, he began renovating the coffee shop space. Every piece of wood, every screw, every touch of paint represented more than just a physical renewal. It was the reconstruction of his life, the recovery of his dignity. The Fremont community, curious about the activity at the site, began to approach, interested in what was happening. James, with his characteristic shyness, explained his idea to those who asked. Some were skeptical, others offered immediate support. But gradually, he realized that his vision was resonating in the hearts of the people around him. On the first Saturday, the coffee shop reopened its doors, not as the business James had originally imagined, but as something much more significant. The tables were rearranged to accommodate workspaces, tools were organized on shelves, and a small area was designated for coffee and snacks. As a meeting point for people to exchange ideas and stories, James began offering free woodworking workshops, teaching basic skills to those who wanted to learn. Gradually, other community members began to share their knowledge. A neighbor taught appliance repair, another, gardening techniques. The coffee shop was now a place of learning, collaboration, and mutual support. Tommy, always curious and full of energy, had become a constant presence at the site. He helped where he could, running around, learning from the adults, and most importantly, having fun. For James, seeing his son smile again, seeing the light in his eyes, was the greatest reward. It was proof that he was on the right path. News of the coffee shop's new purpose began to spread throughout the town. James didn't expect it, but soon realized that people were hungry for a place where they could gather, learn, and strengthen each other. The debts that once seemed insurmountable began to be paid off, penny by penny, as the flow of customers increased, not just for the food and coffee, but for the community that the place represented. Peter was one of the project's biggest supporters. On weekends, he was there, getting his hands dirty, working alongside James and helping to build what had now become a symbol of resilience in Fremont. The coffee shop, which once seemed like a doomed dream, had turned into a safe haven for many, a place where everyone could feel they belonged, that they were valued. Time passed and life began to stabilize. The bills were paid, and the deadline for eviction passed without James having to leave the house. He had not only rebuilt his life but created something that benefited the entire community. The gratitude of the people, the sincere smiles, the thank yous, this was balm for the wounds he carried. Claire, who had remained distant during all this time, heard about the coffee shop's success through mutual friends. One day, while James was busy organizing a workshop, she appeared at the door. The initial shock turned into a warm feeling when he saw her standing there, with a shy smile on her lips. "James," Claire began hesitantly, "I heard about what you've done here, about how you've turned everything around. I knew you could do it." James looked at her, feeling a mix of emotions. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. Claire took a few steps forward, looking around, seeing the fruit of James's work and determination. "Tommy is growing up so fast," she said, changing the subject as her eyes met his. James took a deep breath, feeling a mix of pride and longing. The reunion was bittersweet, filled with unspoken meanings, with words both feared to speak. But there, in front of all the effort he had made to rebuild his life, James felt that he was ready to face anything, including the conversation that was to come. That afternoon, Claire and James talked like they hadn't in a long time. They spoke about the past, about the mistakes made, but also about the future. Claire expressed her admiration for what James had accomplished, but also confessed her own fears, the reasons that made her leave. It was a difficult conversation, but a necessary one, and by the end of it, both knew that there was still much to overcome, but that the first step had been taken. In the following months, Claire began to appear more frequently at the coffee shop, participating in activities, interacting with the community. It wasn't an instant reconciliation, but a process, a path they were both willing to walk. And meanwhile, Tommy, who once asked about his mother with silent pain, now saw her smile by his side, bringing back the warmth he had missed so much. The coffee shop continued to thrive, not just as a business but as a symbol of renewal, of resilience. And James, who once found himself on the brink of the abyss, now walked with his head held high, knowing that no matter what the future brought, he had found within himself the strength to start over, to rebuild, and above all, to keep the promise he made to Tommy, never to give up. With this, James understood that life is made of cycles, of losses and gains, of challenges and triumphs. And in the end, what really matters is not the obstacles we encounter along the way, but the way we choose to face them, with courage, with hope, and above all, with love.